Good afternoon. In the interest of time, I'm going to make the announcements early so we can get going with our speaker, Dr. Karl Hausker. I have a few announcements. My name is Therese Peffer. I am the Associate Director of the Citrus Sustainable Infrastructures Initiative. And let's see, the first announcement is that everything with lunch is compostable, so there are green bins at the back that you can dispose these at the end of the talk. We ask that you do not interrupt the speaker to ask a question. Dr. Hausker has been very generous in allowing 15 minutes at the end to answer questions, so please wait until that time. There's a number of events to be announced. One is that tomorrow Citrus will announce the call for the 2018 seed funding proposals. So we invite principal investigators at UC Berkeley, UC Davis Health, UC Merced, and UC Santa Cruz to apply for seed funding that furthers Citrus and the Banatao Institute's research initiatives and strengthens connections among the UC campuses. So for information about this, please go to the Citrus website. Next Wednesday, October 18th, there will be a talk by Marcy Harris, co-founder and CEO of PopVox. PopVox is a neutral, nonpartisan platform for legislative information and civic engagement. The Citrus Foundry is collecting applications for its spring 2018 cohort. Applications are open now and are due October 27th. So if you are interested in this, please go to citrusfoundry.org for information. Last announcement is November 30th, Citrus and partners are presenting the public event Women in Tech Symposium on Innovation and Entrepreneurship at the UCSC Silicon Valley campus. So the Athena Awards will also be presented at this event to recognize leaders or organizations supporting women in tech. And now for the introduction to our speaker today. Dr. Karl Hausker is a senior fellow in the World Resources Institute's Global Climate Program. He leads analysis and modeling of domestic climate mitigation scenarios, and he contributes to work on the new climate economy, the social cost of carbon, and energy access. He has worked for 28 years in the fields of climate change, energy, and environment in a career that has spanned legislative and executive branches, research institutions, NGOs, and consulting. He has led climate policy analysis and modeling projects for USAID, US EPA, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, the Western Climate Initiative, and the California Air Resources Board. Much of his work has focused on the energy and transportation sectors and on low-carbon, climate-resilient development strategies. He received his MPP and PhD from Berkeley's Goldman School of Public Policy. Go Bears. So with that, will you please help me welcome Dr. Karl Hausker.
Thank you, and as always, it is great to be back on the Berkeley campus. I still miss this place after all these years. I'm going to talk about deep decarbonization of the U.S. economy today. I'm going to talk about two recent studies that looked at pathways for the U.S. to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 80% or more. I'm going to talk about how these two fit into the broader literature on deep decarbonization. Studies that take what I call the all-of-the-above approach, meaning they draw from low-carbon sources like renewables, nuclear power, and carbon capture. There's a whole body of literature that looks at all those options when they do studying and modeling. I'm going to talk about the implementation challenges involved and revealed by those studies. Then I'm going to turn to the question of, could we do this deep decarbonization with 100% renewable energy? A very interesting question that's very much in play in discussions right now and that people have very different opinions on. I'll turn to some synthesis observations on deep decarbonization and the different challenges it proposes, and finally offer some policy implications. My disclaimer, as usual, is I'm speaking for myself, not for the World Resources Institute. We have 800 people globally, and we can never get entirely on the same page. I'm going to move through material very fast until I get to sort of the nub of the debate over how to decarbonize. There'll be a PowerPoint, my PowerPoint posted with links to the studies that I refer to today for those of you who really want to do an even deeper dive into this material. So first, let me turn to the two studies I'm going to introduce you to. First was sponsored by the Risky Business Project. That was the alliance of the three billionaires, Tom Steyer, Michael Bloomberg, and Hank Paulson. And this study came out in December of 2016, titled From Risk to Return, Investing in a Clean Energy Economy. The second study came out almost about the same time. It was the Obama administration's MidCentury Strategy Report, which was submitted as part of the Paris Agreement and submitted to the UNFCCC. Thank goodness they sent it to the UNFCCC, because strangely it has disappeared from the White House website. Both of these have a long shelf life in that they look out to 2050 and chart pathways that could take the US to a much cleaner, low-carbon economy. Let's take, I'm not going to talk about the methodology behind these reports. That would consume my 30 minutes. But as probably many of you know in this room, you can do this kind of modeling in different ways. You can do sort of what-if technology pathway models. You can do a coupled energy and economy model that looks at optimal pathways, least cost pathways to do this. But I'll leave the methodology for you to dig in as you wish. But these two studies and really all studies in this genre rely on three pillars, or three strategies to squeeze the carbon out of the economy. The first is we need to electrify every end use that we can possibly think of. Substitute the use of electricity for the direct combustion of fossil fuels. Supplemented with that, you can also use electricity to make a zero carbon fuel like hydrogen or synthetic methane. So that's pillar number one. Pillar number two is you have to decarbonize all that electricity you're going to use. And again, we have options. We have a variety of renewables. We have nuclear power. We have carbon capture and sequestration that can be put on fossil fuel plants. The third pillar, of course, is to make the economy as energy efficient as possible across the board. If you do these three things in the energy sector, you can dramatically reduce the carbon emissions. This study, Risky Business, only looked at the energy sector and CO2. Well, of course, there's 6 greenhouse gases total, and the Obama administration study covered all 6. But I'm going to focus on the power sector for now. I'll just give you a feel for how we modeled the decarbonization of the economy. This chart shows where we are in 2015 and where we could be in 2050 for fossil energy and for non-fossil energy. And so in 2015 here, of course, we have big blocks of coal and natural gas and oil. Through electrification of end uses and switching to non-fossil electricity, we can squeeze coal down to a tiny slab of where it is today. We can dramatically reduce petroleum use, particularly in the transportation sector. Our modeling here showed that natural gas still plays an important bridge role, both in industry and also being used to produce electricity with carbon capture. Conversely, on the non-fossil fuel side, we see where we are today with relatively small amounts of solar and wind, a slab of nuclear power, and this unfortunately is ethanol, which is one of the worst fuels ever invented. But by 2050, we could expand wind and solar. We could expand somewhat the use of nuclear power. And in our modeling, we assumed that we took the biomass capabilities of the US and made biodiesel and biogas out of it instead of ethanol. So that's what happens kind of in the big picture in the Risky Business study. And I'll just give you a flavor of the power generation. In all of these studies, we don't look at a single pathway, but we look at multiple pathways. And here's what happens in that power sector after you electrify so many end uses. The first thing when you compare the reference level of where we'd be in 2015 with power generation at a little bit over 5,000 billion kilowatt hours, is you need to produce more electricity, obviously, to electrify the economy. You could produce that in various combinations. You could go with one that emphasizes CCS, emphasizes nuclear, emphasizes renewables, or a mixture. All of these have different cost consequences, different implementation issues, but you can also see that in each of these pathways to a cleaner power sector, you have a strong growth in renewables, which is also consistent across the modeling studies we've seen. So it's a matter of relative emphasis. So there's lots of ways to produce cleaner power, and there's also lots of ways to reduce carbon emissions in the transportation sector. Just to give a quick tour of what we did in the risky business study, we had a reference case scenario in transportation of over 25 quads, petroleum, and a little bit of ethanol. And the first thing, looking at that third pillar of decarbonization, is we made the transport sector much more efficient. We dropped total energy use below 15 quads. And then we played with some different pathways that relied on the production of hydrogen in some, the electrification of vehicles in others, and some use of biogas and renewable diesel. Again, we played sort of what-if scenarios on different ways we could satisfy the demand for transportation services in 2050. Let me turn to the MidCentury Strategy Report for a moment, give you a feel for the pathways analyzed there. And I'm sorry for the quality of these graphics, a little hard to see lifted out of the MidCentury Strategy Report. But basically, the Obama White House and DOE and EPA projected a growth in emissions from current levels up to about 10 gigatons under business as usual. And here we have the same three pillars of decarbonization of the energy sector. First, electrification and a switch to low carbon fuels. The second pillar, the switch to low carbon or zero carbon means of producing electricity with some nuclear growth, fossil fuels with CCS and renewables. And then finally, the third pillar, making all sectors more efficient, transportation, buildings, and industry. In addition to the energy sector, as I mentioned before, the MCS report also looks across all 6 gases, looking at your non-CO2 gases here and how emissions can be reduced there, and also looked at the terrestrial sequestration of carbon, and was able to increase our carbon sinks in soils and vegetation. So again, both of these reports show that technologically we can do this using existing commercial technology or near commercial technology. Neither of these reports invents cold fusion or otherwise stretches us into unknown territory. What about the cost? Is this economically feasible? In the risky business report, we took very much a sort of a business focus on what the costs are. We wanted to really zoom in on what are the investments needed, and can the economy absorb the investments. And our summary slide here looked at the decadal averages of the new investments we need to make 2020s, 2030s, 2040s, and what kind of fossil fuel savings we would gain by doing that. And when we aggregated across all sectors, we found that in the 2020s we needed to spend a little bit more than $200 billion a year above base case investment levels. And that would grow to around $400 billion and then somewhat less than $400 billion decadal averages in the 2030s and 2040s. And then on the savings side, fossil fuel savings start low at about $65 billion per year in the 2020s, growing all the way to nearly $700 billion saved in the 2040s. So are these big numbers or small numbers? Can the US economy absorb $200, $300, $400 billion of an additional investment? One way to look at it is the average over the whole 30-year period is roughly the same as what the average spending has been on all forms of US IT spending over the past decade. Another perspective would be to say, right now we have about an $18 trillion gross domestic product. We spend about $3 trillion of that on investments of all kinds, about 16% of the total economy. Spending an extra $200, $300, $400 billion is going to bump that 16% up by a point or two. But the percentage of investment as part of all of GDP fluctuates. You know, since 1980, it's fluctuated between 15 and 22% of GDP. To me, this is a manageable cost to address a global environmental issue, frankly, an existential issue for, we don't really have a choice on whether to solve this or not.
This is not global, this is just US.
This is the US. We're addressing a global problem. But the investment needs are manageable within an $18 trillion economy that, if we continue to chug along at least 2%, is going to grow to a $40 trillion economy by 2050. So I've talked about these two studies, putting them in the context of other similar studies. I want to just give you a very quick flavor of what this kind of all of the above type approach to decarbonization looks like. In September, just last month, the Natural Resources Defense Council released a report called America's Clean Energy Frontier. They also modeled an 80% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050. And interestingly, NRDC also used an all of the above approach and continued to have some use of gas and nuclear amounting to, and some fossil fuel with CCS, covering about 15% of total generation. Throwing in hydro and some geothermal baseload resources, they were still supplying about 25% of total generation with those types of resources, and along with about 75% of wind and solar. So that's another national level study. At the international level, we've seen studies by the International Energy Administration, this one in 2016 called the Energy Technology Perspectives. And again, when they looked at feasible ways to reduce emissions globally from a level that would, like the base case would lead us to maybe a 6-degree increase in temperature, which would be a disaster. And this graph shows how they reduced from a 4-degree scenario to about a 2-degree scenario for warming. Again, 80% plus reductions in the industrialized countries. And they saw an ongoing role for carbon capture and nuclear, in addition to, aggressive growth in renewables and energy efficiency. In their reduction scenarios, going from 4 degrees to trying to keep warming to 2 degrees, nuclear and carbon capture were responsible for about 26% of the total reductions. Another study of recent vintage is the Energy Transitions Commission report from earlier this year, a report called Better Energy, Greater Prosperity. And they also aimed for a global scenario by 2040 of trying to keep warming on a path to 2 degrees or less. And their scenario too, looking across worldwide, they're very bullish on renewable energy and think that we can get costs down to about $70 a megawatt hour by 2035. But at the same time, the global mix grew to about 45% variable renewable energy, your wind and your solar PV. But then they had 23% hydro bioenergy, other renewable energy, still about 10% nuclear, 22% still fueled by fossil fuels, some of it with carbon capture. So this is the sort of what I would call the broad mainstream literature of how to decarbonize at the national level or at the global level. It's those 3 pillars: electrify as much as you can, go low or zero carbon, and be very efficient. We can do it. We have the technologies already. Technology progress, of course, will bring more pleasant surprises, economically manageable costs. Other US studies have modeled the cost at 1% to 2% of GDP, manageable within a growing economy. So the barriers in my view, aren't really technological or economic, but the barriers have to do with political will and policy. We know that currently renewables, nuclear, CCS, they all face siting problems, permitting issues, et cetera. We know that renewables face the challenge of figuring out how to balance load with variable output. They're geographically distributed in certain ways. We have to get the power from where the renewable energy is to load centers. Nuclear faces problems with chronic cost overruns and lingering concerns about operational safety, waste management, and proliferation concerns. Carbon capture projects, the cost is still relatively high compared to other options. Some projects are having, again, cost overruns. And if we go in a big way in this direction, we have to scale up a whole CO2 pipeline infrastructure, we have to find the right geological formations. And there's concerns over operational safety and the permanence of injecting CO2 into underground formations. So again, these are all problems that we overcome, but hopefully doable along with other implementation challenges that I want to tick through here. The rate of power plant construction to electrify the economy, it's challenging. We would have to build out at 2 to 4 times some of the historic rates of power plant construction that we've seen in the past. Not impossible, but a little daunting. We'd also have to expand the transmission and distribution system to accommodate the electrification. And again, there's a lot of NIMBY issues wherever you try to build a transmission line. I think there's some very interesting issues connected with electrifying the transport sector, which seems like the most likely path. The hydrogen fuel cell path seems less likely from our current perspective, but may still be workable. But how do we get the electric sector and the transport sector to work together? Are we charging vehicles in the workplace, peak hours, daytime? Are we charging them at home? Do we have fast charge technology, slow charge technology? Are we doing battery swapping? Those are issues yet to work out, and those two sectors, I think, need to work together in a way that historically they have not had to. To fuel a large expansion in the power sector, we have to think about our utility business models. We need to think about the design of our power markets. Already challenging issues now, but I think we need to even put more focus on them if we're going to scale up the power sector in the way needed. We need business models and market designs that are compatible with variable generation, that are compatible with nuclear and CCS getting financing, compatible with distributed energy sources and smart grids and smart devices. All these discussions are underway now, even with our current challenges, but we really need to solve them if we're going to expand the power sector significantly over the next 30 years. A final issue that's really vexing, and I don't know exactly what to do with it, is picture this. What if globally we are successful in reducing fossil fuel use dramatically, cutting emissions 80 or 90%? What's going to happen to global fossil fuel prices? They're probably going to go down. Well, they will go down if you drop demand by that much. And so in a sense, each year that we do that, fossil fuels will become cheaper. It's a global market, upward curving supply curve. Our policy regimes to do this need to be resilient in the face of falling fossil fuel prices. It's almost like sort of being on a treadmill and the elevation keeps inclining, it becomes tougher. We need resilient policy mechanisms that can deal with falling fossil fuel prices. And just to illustrate the nature of the capacity additions, this is from the MCS report. The Risky Business report has similar numbers. This chart shows us the historical additions to capacity in the US. We had a big bubble of gas expansion in the early 2000s. That dropped off. And here we see wind and solar coming on strong, along with additions in natural gas combined cycle plants. But we need to elevate that game even more out to 2035, adding over 40 gigawatts per year of different sources. And after 2035, we need to scale that up even more aggressively to over 70 gigawatts per year of various sources. So that's, again, it's not impossible, but we need the policy structures, the financial structures, the market designs, and the utility business models that lets that expansion happen. So now I'm going to segue to renewable energy. And here, as I'm sure many of you know, the news of the last 8 or 10 years is fantastic, and it's encouraging. We have seen the price of solar and wind drop dramatically. The blue line is the utility scale solar dropping from over $350 a megawatt hour down to the $100 range. Rooftop solar also dropping significantly. Wind was it was somewhat more mature 10 years ago, but has continued to drop in cost as measured by the levelized cost of energy. And here in the bars, of course, you see the growth in renewable capacity in the US over those years. So this is all good news and will make the transition easier and cheaper. But it's important to understand what's really going on cost-wise. And again, I'm sorry for the tiny print of the what you may have seen. Lazard each year puts out a levelized cost of energy analysis, and when they take a snapshot of the average cost of power from different sources, we have our alternative energy sources here: solar PV of different types, concentrated solar thermal, biomass, wind. We see prices down in the $30 to $60 a megawatt hour for wind. That's great news. The utility scale solar on average is in the $50 to $60 range. It's interesting to note, solar residential rooftop unsubsidized is still very costly, up in the over $100 to $200 a megawatt range. And we compare that to gas combined cycle in the $50 to $80 range, nuclear $100 to $200, coal under controlled $60 and above. So this is a snapshot of the average cost of power from these different sources, assuming a certain capacity factor with your capital costs and your operating costs. Let me say, the thing I really want to draw your attention to, because this is somewhat good news, but bad, but I'm going to tell some bad news too, is when people look at the levelized cost of energy numbers from Lazard or Bloomberg that generally tell a very good news story, they often ignore some of the fine print, even though it's right on the page there. Fine print that says, certain alternative energy generating technology are cost competitive with some conventional technologies under some scenarios. Such observation does not take into account potential social and environmental externalities or reliability-related concerns like transmission, backup generation costs, particularly associated with variable renewables. So we need to make sure we read the fine print and we understand the fine print that you don't plan or build or operate a power grid based on the levelized cost of energy. It's simply an interesting metric for the average cost. All of these sources interact with when you actually operate a power grid. And if the power grid operates in a way that the capacity factor of a certain technology drops, which is what often happens with renewables, your average cost skyrockets. So we can come back to that. But I think, therefore, the conclusions that some people are drawing is that when they look at a Lazard or Bloomberg chart like that, say renewables have reached grid parity. They cost the same or lower than conventional technologies. I think people also sometimes look at the wholesale markets and conclude that renewables are beating conventional energy sources because renewables bid in at zero. You bid your variable cost into a wholesale power market, and of course you're dispatched first in the merit order. We also see natural gas beating out coal and nuclear in many markets because natural gas prices have sunk so low. But understand that renewable energy is getting its revenue stream often outside of the wholesale power market. It bids in at zero, but In many cases, it has a long-term power contract that really secures the financing for that. It does not cost zero to build and operate renewable energy. So again, a simplistic interpretation of what's going on in wholesale power markets can lead to the conclusion that the economic competition is over and renewables are just beating everything. And I'm sorry, but I beg to differ. If you do think in those terms, then you will start saying baseload power plants are not needed anymore, they're obsolete, renewables have won the day. But I think the world is a little more complex than that. What we see kind of in the political realm is that the good news about the cost of renewables dropping and the focus on, I think, in my view, kind of the wrong metrics on real costs is leading people to say, let's just do this decarbonization with 100% renewables. We see Hawaii setting a goal of 100% RE by 2045. In their case, an island with a very rich renewable resource base, that may be perfectly possible. Of course, we have California. Senate bills setting goals of 100% renewables by 2045. We see similar moves in Washington and Oregon. At the national level, we've seen 4 senators introduce a 100 by 50 act, 100% renewables or clean energy. It's a little ambiguous sometimes by 2050. We see companies pledging to go 100% renewable. We see groups of mayors, over 150 mayors, pledging their cities will go 100% clean or renewable. So there's definitely a groundswell for wanting to move in this direction, at least symbolically, if not more substantively. We also have very prominent academic, Mark Jacobson at Stanford, who has put out pathways for 100% wind, water, and solar. Probably the most cited study by advocates of a 100% renewable path. But for those of you who want to follow this area closely, you should be aware that there was a very comprehensive critique of Jacobson's work that came out this summer. About 20 leading authors in the climate energy space who concluded that Jacobson's work used invalid modeling tools, contained modeling errors, implausible assumptions. These are fighting words in academia. As polite as that sounds, that's about as harsh as it gets. So I urge you to read Jacobson's original work, read the critique, and see what you think about the plausibility of that. So I want to turn finally to some synthesis observations on these decarbonization studies. The great paper came out in March of this year by my colleague Jesse Jenkins at MIT, and he and his co-author looked at about 20 studies in depth and teased out some of the common themes. The first one is that if you build a system dominated by variable renewables, not geothermal or hydro or biomass, which is more baseload and often or can be dispatched, if you lean very heavily on wind and solar, you have to build a physically larger system, sometimes with capacity 3 to 4 times peak demand. That has implications. If you rely on variable generation for most of your power, you have to back it up, either with a shadow system of dispatchable generation and or some combination of long duration seasonal energy storage, 2 to 3 months of US electric consumption, stored as electricity in batteries or potentially in some form of thermal storage if that's the end use that you're going to use it on. But just think for a moment. Right now, we're building relatively small battery facilities to balance daily load, fluctuating daily load, make sure we balance the system. The seasonal balance we need is measured in months of consumption. That's unprecedented. That's a huge technical challenge. you're going to, by sort of overbuilding above peak to try to squeeze out the last conventional generation, you're going to have significant curtailment, even if you have storage, even if you have an expanded transmission system and creative demand response. The system still shows a lot of curtailment. You're going to have to expand transmission a lot, and all these factors lead to cost differences. So I'm going to illustrate these with a quick run-through of a 2012 NREL study, National Renewable Energy Lab, that looked at an 80% renewable system. And it illustrates a number of things. Even though it's 5 years old, some of the principles are the same, and we'll turn to a more recent study quickly. First of all, this NREL study shows how you can layer conventional resources along with biomass and hydro, and then your PV and your wind, and you sort of fill up the load curve. And that's for your peak demand. But then when you turn to your off-peak, your lowest coincident dispatch days, say in spring, you've built all that capacity, but you're just not able to use a lot of the power. Here, your curtailment becomes a huge percentage of your total electricity production. Similarly, from the NREL study, you see this graph shows the overbuild necessary. I was just showing you numbers from the 80% renewable scenario. They ran great numbers going from 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90% renewable. And you can see how the total gigawatts you have to have on hand, because of the variable nature, start to skyrocket as you add storage and you add huge amounts of wind and solar to make up for the variability. Finally, there are cost impacts. In the 2012 NREL study, the final cost of power at the retail level started to climb from a little over $100 a megawatt up to over 160 by the time you hit 90% renewables, and it would, of course, go even higher with 100% renewables. Similar effects of trying to get to the very high percentage of renewables were shown in a study by Bethany Frew and other authors who are also at NREL. This is from 2016. And she and her co-authors looked at moving from 20% renewables, RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standard, to 40 to 60 to 80 to 100. And this is a very busy graph, and I hope to simplify it in a future presentation with her permission. But I want you to just think of, there's basically two scenarios going on here. There are scenarios where the power system builds enough transmission to wheel power easily across the country. And those cluster in these 4 bars. The other 2 scenarios are where that transmission is not built, and individual regions have to build to meet their own power sources. And what you find is that if we can wheel power pretty freely across the country, we can get up to 80% renewables with pretty steady costs, incremental cost of only about $300 billion per year. However, when you try to squeeze that last 20% of conventional out with variable renewables like solar and wind, your incremental cost more than doubles to over $700 billion. If you can't freely wheel that power around the country, you have more of a steady increase from 60 to 80 to 100% renewables, going from 400, near 700 to over about $1.2 trillion in additional cost over lower levels. So, and the black diamonds show the escalating amounts of curtailment, power that's just wasted because you're just generating and spilling so many renewables. So let me close quickly with some policy implications. Again, different analysts may have different views on this. I myself am kind of in the all of the above category. I think we need to keep all the options on the table. We need to develop safer, cheaper nuclear plants. We need to develop carbon capture technology in addition to taking advantage of renewables. we need to think about this not just from a US perspective or a California perspective or Hawaii perspective. We need to think about this from a global perspective. There are countries with very slim renewable resource bases. The US is blessed with a lot of hydro, a lot of solar, a lot of wind potential. Not every country is like that. What are they going to turn to? Who's going to commercialize and make safe those technologies? What if you're a small country and you're in an area that hasn't been that politically stable over the last year, hasn't been subject to world wars or battles with its neighbors? Can we tell them, build the transmission and freely wield the power over vast differences? That's a geopolitical issue that we don't really face in this country, in this hemisphere, on this continent. And also, think about if the US and the EU and other developed countries, advanced countries, abandon the nuclear industry, if they abandon the effort to make carbon capture safe and affordable, who is going to be setting those standards? Other countries, right now, Russia and China are building a lot of nuclear reactors, the lion's share globally. And there's also interest in carbon capture, of course, in China and India. Do we want to work with those countries to make sure operational standards, waste standards, permanent standards, proliferation concerns are addressed effectively? So you need to think about that question. Finally, just sort of obviously, we need. I would advocate a diverse RD&D portfolio across all these sources. Also remembering that we need carbon capture for industrial sources that don't even combust fossil fuel but produce CO2 through the industrial processes. We will need that, and we may need a negative emission source down the road, biomass power with carbon capture that would actually be a net negative emission source. And finally, I'll just leave you with the thought, no matter what we do, we need to overcome NIMBY problems with the siting of transmission lines. We can't do this all with rooftop solar. So I'll stop there and look forward to your questions. And like I say, I know I moved through a lot of material, but if you're a glutton, you can dig into the links. Thank you.
Hi, I have a clarification question. I'm trying to remember, but I think it's when you were going to the Risky Business Report, you indicated that there were 3 columns. For the 2020 decade, we'd have to spend $200 billion. And I think, was that per year, $200 billion per year?
An average per decade.
Just
average annual for the 2020s, 2030s, 2040s.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So if I multiply that out, if it's roughly $300 billion on average per year for 30 years, that's about $10 trillion, roughly $9 trillion or so. And that, I'm trying to jive that with what I remember from the Jacobson report that sort of suggested that we could convert the whole planet to renewables for like 125 trillion, which is like 4 times, about 10 times more than that. So do you have like a sense of like what the total package would be if we wanted to, integrate over all that to switch to roughly 100% renewable, or even 90 or 80 as in the later graphs show?
I'm not that familiar with Jacobson's global numbers on cost, nor on the tip of my tongue with his US numbers. So all I can say with some certainty that the Risky Business Report is pretty much in the mainstream of other modeling efforts, particularly like the Energy Modeling Forum does this exercise every couple of years to reach like an 80% goal for the US. And I think the more credible models will put the cost at 1 to 2% of GDP. You'll always have some model that's very sticky and assumes the worst in terms of ability for the economy to evolve. That might put the cost at 4 or 5% of GDP. But the risky business numbers are in that realm of this is manageable within 1.5% of GDP.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So
yes.
I'm so glad that at the end of your presentation you mentioned being carbon negative, because I think that's inevitable that we have to have some carbon negative strategies. One of them is airplanes. Can't do carbon capture from airplanes very well. and the other you mentioned, the non-cooperative countries. And even for seasonal storage, we do have a way of storing seasonally. It's called hydrocarbons. So it's a bit awkward, but it can be overcome by being carbon negative. However, in thinking about being carbon negative, people often think about stuffing carbon dioxide in the ground, which I think that might be a little bit dangerous. On the other hand, what I haven't heard discussed is agro-sequestration. That is to say, growing crops and stuffing them into the ground. And do you know anyone who's done a study of that?
No, I've heard of it in sort of qualitatively, but I have not. It has not been incorporated into the studies that I've looked at, nor into risky business. But it's something that needs attention. In a sense, we need to look at all the options, put nothing off the table at this point. And again, I think you're absolutely correct that unless we move pretty aggressively over the next 20 years or so, later in the century, we're going to need a lot of net negative options to turn to.
Right. On the subject of using agriculture, one of the things I can do without a complicated calculation is to figure out what it would cost me to buy all the wheat and all the corn in the world. So these are two very large crops. And I can buy all the wheat for about $100 billion a year. And I can buy all the corn for another $100 billion a year. So this is an indication. Agriculture is a little bit more efficient than some of the other options that are out there.
Thanks.
Well, you showed the charts with the variable sources resulted in a lot of curtailment. Have you seen studies about the cost of converting the spare electricity into hydrogen and then combining with agriculture to form hydrocarbons or ethers to provide the seasonal balance?
Right. Both the Risky Business Study and the MidCentury Strategy Report both looked at options for using that, deliberately creating capacity, sort of overcapacity, and using that to produce hydrogen. It's still a fairly expensive fuel, but and you'll see in the details of our report, you'll see how hydrogen and synthetic methane played a role in meeting the overall goals. Like the NREL study and the FRU study did not couple with hydrogen production, but certainly in theory, you could blend that into this modeling exercise.
Hi, so I was curious, so you mentioned in there, following up on hydrogen, that you didn't think the hydrogen fuel cell pathway was really as practical for transportation. And so California has definitely done a lot to sort of make hydrogen fuel cells more possible, and Toyota released the car last year. Why do you think it's not as practical as electric?
Yeah, I don't want to rule it out. And I really said that kind of as a gut check. It seems that there's much more interest in electric vehicles at this point from the consumer end. The cost seems to be coming down pretty fast. You have you have Europe and China talking about outlawing gasoline vehicles, and everybody seems to be talking more electric. But we shouldn't rule it out, nor should we rule out hydrogen or biogas or biodiesel, again filling niche roles in freight or air transport. Again, we haven't figured out how to fly a plane with batteries yet. And also not touched on here is potentially biofuel from algae. It's again, it's potentially there. It isn't worked into any of these modeling studies because it's not close enough to being commercial. Again, most of these studies say, what's commercial now or near commercial? Let's put that in the models. But I certainly hope that we can achieve breakthroughs in algae-based biofuels, obviously, because then we don't have the competition with land for production of food.
Hi, I actually don't know the answer to this question. At what value of a carbon tax would CCS become economically viable on the grid?
I think the current people bullish on CCS think that we can get it down into the $50 or $60 per ton range. So carbon tax of that magnitude might be able to make CCS feasible. But again, we have a ways to go on really getting to that point, and then also, of course, getting the political will to either require CCS or induce it with a carbon tax. One other sort of just policy implication that I put out there, I don't have a view on this yet, but it's something we should think about. We're building lots of natural gas combined cycle plants now. They spring up like weeds, particularly in the wholesale power markets. At what point should there be some policy that says we need to at least make those carbon capture ready? You know, is there some incremental cost so we don't get totally locked into a huge fleet of natural gas combined cycle plants that have no option for reducing their emissions?
I'm looking at the graph that you have on right now, and it seems to me a rather naive way to look at it, especially the 100% or 80% penetration, is that with a little bit of investment in transmission, you can save tons of money in terms of storage. And I wonder, what is the price of storage? What is the projection for price of electrical storage, let's say in 2050, compared to where today?
Yeah, I don't have that at the tip of my tongue. I'm not sure what they're projecting out that far. Costing storage is very complex in terms of how are you using it? Are you using it sort of for energy to fill vast periods of time when you need kilowatt hours? Or are using it for load balancing more instantaneously in short bursts? Are using it daily, weekly, monthly? So I don't have that's a great area to plunge into further. But I don't have rules of thumb handy on the cost of storage.
Hi. Regarding the seasonal storage, I think that's a major debate, and you have like large companies like Royal Dutch, Shell, saying that they are kind of betting into hydrogen to be the solution for seasonal storage. So I don't know whether you have any sort of sensitivity around numbers when you're seeing that renewable energy prices are just keep going down. I don't know whether you're aware of the recent auction in Saudi Arabia, in which the winning solar price was around like $21 per megawatt hour. I think on all those projections from Bloomberg and GTM, they're always off. I am coming from the solar industry in the last 8 years and always seeing things down. So I don't know whether you have any threshold of LCOE or energy price in which hydrogen will make sense economically to be used for seasonal storage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. I don't have any quick facts or projections on that, but certainly it's very interesting. We're seeing, particularly in some parts of the world, these incredibly low power purchase agreements of, say, $20, $21 a megawatt hour. Again, very encouraging. At the same time, we have to take them with a little grain of salt and ask what subsidies, hidden or overt, underlie that. What have governments provided in terms of land or tax treatment? We always want that. It's important to look at what is the. It's useful to look at the actual contractual power purchase price, but then you also need to lift the hood and say what are the real costs underneath that. If we, and I guess to make a sweeping statement, if we can just generate massive amounts of cheap power at $20 a megawatt hour, and batteries become dirt cheap, then we can probably run the whole system on renewables. We're not there yet, but you could see storing it in batteries, storing it in thermal, storing it by producing hydrogen. But again, the question, I think the question I want to put to all of you is, at this point, does the US or does the world as a whole put all of its chips on that pathway? Or do you spread your chips and make sure that you develop a portfolio of technologies that could solve this problem? We have one in the back.
Actually, we are out of time, so I'm sorry. Do you have time to stay after?
Very,
for a
very
few
happy to
questions?
stay and talk with anyone who'd like to continue.
Okay.
Thanks
Please
again.
join me in thanking Dr. Hausker.